One of the main objectives of Formula One's recent rules revolution was to close up the field. So for the second season of ground effect technical regulations introduced last year, things will get a lot closer, right? If you apply conventional wisdom, which states the longer the rules are stable, the closer the competition gets, the answer is yes. And historically, that trend does broadly hold true. But F1's current situation means it will likely not be as straightforward as that. Hopefully, 2023 will produce a closer championship battle among as many teams as possible, but there are worrying signs that mean anyone expecting the field to close up dramatically this year will likely face a painful reality check. That's because of what the historical trends reveal when you look a little closer, and the fact that it's going to take more time for the full effects of the new rules to be felt. F1's 2022 regulations aim to make the field more competitive in multiple ways. This objective has been attacked not only technically, but also through the financial and sporting regulations, as well as the Concord Agreement that binds together the teams, the FIA, and commercial rights holder Liberty Media. The rules for the new generation of ground effect cars are highly prescriptive. This is not only to improve the raceability of the cars, but also limit the development scope so that the performance spread is tight. The FIA also has the right to ban legal designs for the following season should they go against these intentions, as it has done with the Aston Martin rear wing end plates and the Mercedes front wing end plates for 2023. Along with the raising of the floor edges to tackle porpoising problems, these are the only major changes to what is largely a stable set of rules. The financial regulations governing the cost cap are also an important factor. While the cost cap kicked in for 2021, this was originally conceived to be introduced with the technical regulations before the COVID-19 pandemic intervened. With the money teams can spend on their core business, i.e. designing, developing and racing its cars, capped, the potential of the 10 teams should theoretically be similar. The Concord Agreement covering 2021 to 2025 also plays a part in this by ensuring the share of F1's revenue taken by the teams is distributed more equitably. The Aerodynamic Testing Regulations, ATR for short, also contribute. This is effectively a handicap that limits wind tunnel and CFD testing on a sliding scale, with the most given to the lowest placed team and the least to the top team. There has never been so concerted a regulatory effort to close up the field in F1 history using such a broad range of tools. So when considering the historical case studies, it's important to remember that this is a far more all-encompassing strategy than anything seen before. The question here is whether the effect will be felt in the short term. F1's rules have never been stable for long. Over the years, the rulebook has grown steadily, with the current technical regulations running to 183 pages. For our case studies, we're going to look only at the past 40 years of F1. This is because the further back you go, the more different F1 becomes and the less relevant a comparison it is. Stretching back to 1983, when the flat floor regulations outlawed pure ground effect cars, there have been 9 major rules overhauls, including that of 2022. This gives us 8 historical case studies to take a look at. In order to make comparisons more meaningful, we'll look at the top 10 teams both for the season of the rule change and the following year. To do this, we'll use our Supertimes methodology, which takes each team's single fastest lap of a race weekend expressed as a percentage of the outright quickest. This can then be averaged out to give a performance index for the full season. The reason we're only looking at the top 10 teams is that 10 is the smallest number of teams on the grid during the seasons in question, and to eliminate some of the more ramshackle outfits that were woefully uncompetitive primarily thanks to their own inadequacies rather than F1's rules. Our first case study is the 1983 changes that effectively banned ground effect cars via the flat bottom rules. In 1983, Ferrari had the fastest car on average and won the Constructors' Championship, although Nelson Piquet won the driver's title for Brabham. The following year, the field was a little closer, particularly in terms of the gap from first to second, which closed up by just over 0.5%. But although the 10th fastest car was less off the pace, the overall spread in the pack wasn't dramatically tighter. The ban on turbo engines kicked in for 1989. Although the majority of the field ran normally aspirated engines the year before, 4 of the top 5 ran turbos. But in 1989, it was still McLaren Honda on top. For the second year of this rule cycle, Ferrari roughly halved the gap to McLaren and became a genuine title threat. And while the top 10 spread was similar, things did close up significantly in terms of the top 5. 1994 was the year of the so-called electronic gizmo ban, with active suspension, traction control and ABS, among others, outlawed. And while that made life difficult for Williams and Benetton's Michael Schumacher claimed his first driver's title, Williams still had the fastest car on average and won the Constructors' Championship. For the second year of this rules period in 1995, the competitive spread in the top 10 is similar in the top 5, albeit with the caveat that there was a reduction in engine capacity from 3.5 to 3 litres, and significantly more spread out across the top 10 thanks to a combination of the gains made by the big teams and the fact those lower down the order with customer engines were at an even bigger power deficit. In 1998, narrow track cars and groove tyres were introduced, with McLaren taking the initiative. For the second season of these rules, not a great deal changed. The gap at the front was, on average, similar, as was the spread of the top 5 and top 10. The top 2 were much closer on performance in the following 2 years, although Ferrari later asserted its dominance. The switch to 2.4 litre engines in 2006 didn't have an immediate effect, with the chassis regulations largely stable, although this is a case where the top 10 closed up in the second year. But even then, the front group became smaller, with Honda dropping off and the fourth quickest team's deficit to the pace increasing significantly. The first season of the skinny aerodynamic regulations in 2009 produced a remarkably close field, with just 1.4% covering the top 10. In the second season, the spread was dramatically increased throughout the field, but there were mitigating factors, including the fact 10th quickest team Lotus Racing was a brand new operation, Sauber becoming an independent again after BMW's withdrawal, and the ban on customer cars that inevitably slowed Toro Rosso. Also, Red Bull was able to design its car from scratch around the double diffuser concept in a way it couldn't in 2009, when the field was also kept tighter by the fact that early season dominant Force Brawn lacked the development budget to build its advantage and slipped backwards. The introduction of the 1.6 litre V6 turbo engines had a big impact on the competitive order, with Mercedes dominating and the team that led the way for the preceding 4 seasons, Red Bull, slumping thanks to Renault engine struggles. Not much changed in the second season. In fact, Mercedes was more dominant and failed to win only 2 races, with the spread from front to back larger. Even if you take just the top 5, the spread was about 1/3 larger than the previous year, with Red Bull slipping even further off the pace. In 2017, F1 brought in bigger cars generating more downforce and wider tyres. Mercedes stayed on top, as was usually the case during this era. But there was little change in terms of how close the field was for the second year of the regs, save for Sauber making a big step, having been cast off the back in 2014. Otherwise, things were similar. Each of the 7 examples we've looked at has produced a slightly different pattern in the second season. But on average, while there is a small gain in the gap between the top 2 and the spread of the top 5, it's not a dramatic shift. The top 10 is over 0.5% on average more spread out, although that's distorted by a couple of outlier cases. There's also a slight increase on average in the standard deviation. That's a measure of the spread of each dataset compared to the mean average, so generally it means the gap between each individual team is slightly larger. So history tells us that while there can be a gentle effect in year 2 in terms of the field closing up, it's not usually a dramatic shift. So what do we know about the way the 10 teams are poised right now? Well, there's no reason to expect the gap between the top 3 and the rest to disappear. That's down to the size of the advantage F1's biggest teams built up over the previous decade in terms of facilities and knowledge. The leading midfielders last year, Alpine and McLaren, also have their sights focused beyond 2023. Alpine is just 1 year into its much vaunted 100 race plan to emerge as a regular front-runner, while McLaren has long said it doesn't anticipate being able to make major inroads on the top teams until 2024, once its new wind tunnel gets up and running this year. Further down the order, Aston Martin is moving into a new factory and waiting on its new wind tunnel, which will start to be used in 2024, while the Sauber-run Alfa Romeo team is still recovering from the financial difficulties of the post-BMW era and ramping up after a difficult decade. now with the focus on building towards 2026 when it becomes the Audi Works team. And while the FIA aimed for the field to close up, the expectation was always that this would take several years. As its head of single-seater technical matters, Nicholas Tombazis, said, if the gaps in the competitive order are as big as this in 5 years down the line, it will be a bigger concern. It's going to take time for the field to close up, but there are reasons to expect it to do so. With F1's rules largely stable until the end of 2025 ahead of the introduction of the new power units, with beefier hybrid systems and modified chassis, it should be in the 2 years that follow 2023 that we start to see the effect of the new rules in closing up the field. So for this year, while history suggests there might be a slight closing up of the grid, it will be far from transformative. We're going to have to wait a little longer for the chance of that setting in.